Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation, our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy check to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And, of course, those watching online are welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion and welcoming our guest today is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. He began his capital career here on the Hill as a policy aide to Senator John McCain, later served as senior professional Republican staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, advising on East Asia affairs. Before joining us here, he was at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, serving as the council's senior country director, as well as being named the council's senior vice president and executive director. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter.
Thank you all for coming out. I was sitting behind Bruce's tag there, I think, but if you watch television at all, you know I'm not Bruce Klingner. Bruce gets quite a bit of coverage, and so that's good for me, not being confused with him. As John said, I'm Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center here. I just wanted to take a minute to welcome everyone to this international symposium we're doing with INSS, Institute for National Security Strategy. I particularly wanted to thank President Jo Dong-ho and INSS scholars who've traveled so far to come here for this. Heritage has had a long relationship with INSS. We've been exchanging views on North Korea for quite some time. Especially goes, again, for Bruce, because Bruce is back and forth across the Pacific to Seoul quite a bit. In fact, he's just back, right? Just back this week, yeah. We work together. We work together quite a bit. Several others of us have also traveled to Seoul recently to participate in INSS conferences, in addition to Bruce, myself, my boss, Jim Carafano, Dean Cheng, who you may know does our China political security issues, Robin Simcox, General Spoor. In addition, in 2015, we actually did a joint conference together in Seoul that many of us participated in. So we're particularly pleased today to welcome INSS and return the favor of hosting them here. So the way these things work is we do a joint conference, but if you're on the ground, you're the one doing most of the work to pull it together. And when we went last time, they did a wonderful job for us, and so we're glad to be able to return the favor and in the process have some very good conversation analysis about what's going on really the top issue in U.S.-Asia policy at this point in time. Comes at a particularly important point, I would say, a particularly opportune time to have this conference. We have new leaderships in both the U.S. and in South Korea. They're still forming strategies towards North Korea, but I think it's also fair to say they're still forming strategies vis-a-vis one another. The alliance is holding strong, I would say, but you know, it's a work in progress, I think, on both sides, exactly how we're going to approach one another. North Korea is continuing its defiance of the international community by conducting ever more dangerous nuclear and missile tests, and that's something that we're dealing with. President Trump is about to embark on his first visit to Asia, as you know, and one of the first stops on that trip will be South Korea. So again, it comes at a very opportune time to have this discussion. We've got really incredible experts, both from Seoul and Washington, to talk to us on this. So I'm going to turn the podium over in a second to Dong-ho. But before I do that, I just want to mention a couple of things about his biography so you know where he's coming from. He's just president of INSS for the last month or so. He's come new to this job. Before that, he was 10 years professor of North Korean studies at Ewha Women's University, now on leave from that position. He also served for 18 years as director of North Korean Economic Research Center at the Korean Development Institute. So he's very knowledgeable, especially about the Korean economy, and now in a leadership position at INSS where he can bring some of that knowledge to bear. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Jo, and he can get us started. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Director Walter Ludman, Dr. Bruce Klinger, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor and privilege to speak at this meaningful event. Institute for National Security Strategy, INSS, which I am belonging to, and Heritage Foundation have an MOU for academic exchanges and close cooperation between the two organizations. Our partnership was very timely because, as all of you know, tensions are rising on the Korean Peninsula and the East Asia Pacific region. North Korea's nuclear and missile program also poses a great threat to the international community. As the US and South Korea are leading international efforts to resolve the North Korea problem, we cannot emphasize enough the importance of robust US-ROK relations in various sectors and fields. As research and analysis institutions, we play a unique role in formulating foreign and national security policies. Therefore, the collaboration between our two leading think tanks is essential, especially given the new administrations took office recently in both countries. As world top-ranked think tank, Heritage Foundation sets an example for other research institutions in the world. We, INSS, feel grateful for the opportunity to work together with the foundation in our shared efforts to better serve policymakers and eventually help bringing peace into the Korean Peninsula. INSS celebrates the 40th anniversary this year, and I understand that the Heritage Foundation will celebrate its 45th anniversary next year. I sincerely hope that we further strengthen our partnership for another 40 years to come. Lastly, I want to express my deep appreciation to Elizabeth Rosenberg, Senior Fellow and Director at Center for New American Security, and Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, for giving insightful and informative presentations today. Thank you again for having me here, and I very much look forward to the result of our symposium today. 감사합니다. Thank you.
First of all, I want to add my welcome to everyone and thank you for coming here, and also particularly to our Korean colleagues who traveled all the way over the Pacific to be a part of this conference. And we also welcome the opportunity to interact with our INSS counterparts and colleagues. As Walter has pointed out, we've had a long and very beneficial relationship. Usually when we start a Korea-related conference, we can always count on North Korea having just done something bad, so that we can always say, well, you know, it's particularly timely that we meet today because North Korea just did something the day before. Well, they've actually been a little bit quiet for a while, so I couldn't count on that. So, but instead, it is also particularly opportune, the timing, given that President Trump will soon be going to Asia within a few weeks. So we can always count on it being timely for some reason. Because you know, as we look out over the political landscape of Asia right now, and this is what President Trump will be facing as he travels, there's a lot to be concerned about. Obviously, North Korea, which already has the ability to attack South Korea and Japan, our critical allies, with nuclear weapons, and they've had that capability for several years. They're now really nearing the quest, if not already achieved, a nuclear ICBM to hit the continental U.S. I think over the years there's been a tendency by many to downplay or dismiss North Korea's capabilities on not only military but also on cyber, and then that leads to a lot of surprises when North Korea achieves exactly what North Korea said they would do. So right now there are questions that people have on the direction and the steadfastness of both the South Korean and the U.S. policies towards North Korea. And there's a debate over what are Pyongyang's nuclear objectives. Is it simply to deter what it perceives as the U.S. hostile policy, or whether does it have more offensive intentions once it achieves that capability? And there are also concerns about whether the U.S. is contemplating an attack on North Korea to complete it from completing the development of that ICBM, in essence, beginning a war to deter a war. And I'll admit, when I look at South Korea, I'm surprised at the degree to which President Moon Jae-in has moved to the center on foreign policy and on his North Korea policy. I had thought things would be much more of a strained relationship, thinking back on the relationship between Washington and Seoul during the No Myung years. But really, President Moon has adopted many policies of what one would have expected of a conservative president. He allowed deployment of the THAAD ballistic missile defense system. He admitted that reopening the Kaesong economic venture with North Korea would be a violation of UN resolutions. He's rejected calls by North Korea to offer up the joint U.S.-South Korean military exercises as collateral for getting North Korea to freeze nuclear and missile tests. And he's emphasized that now is the time for pressure and not dialogue with North Korea until Pyongyang indicates a shift in its policy. So all of these were very welcomed by the United States. And much of that, I think, was driven not only by the strong public opinion polls in South Korea, which shows very strong support for the alliance with the U.S., perhaps the strongest in history of the polling, but also by North Korean behavior. And so just as North Korea did with Barack Obama when he came into office, extending an open hand of dialogue, and North Korea quickly and emphatically rejected that, North Korea has acted the same to Moon Jae-in, contrary to what many had hoped, that they would act better towards a progressive or liberal president in South Korea than to a conservative. So I think once again it shows that the reason for the tension and the stalemate between the U.S. and North Korea and South Korea and North Korea is because the fault lies in Pyongyang, not in Seoul or Washington. So North Korea rejected even offers by President Moon for dialogue and humanitarian assistance, dismissing them as nonsense. And so really North Korea's behavior has even more had a constraint on President Moon's efforts at reaching out to the North. So right now, as a result, the Washington and Seoul relationship is very, very strong. We share a common view on the threat from North Korea. And earlier this year, there was a very successful summit between Presidents Moon and Trump. And I think as President Trump goes to Asia, we're hoping that when he's there, he'll really get the opportunity to see the strong South Korean support for the alliance, as well as get a feel for the danger that exists on the peninsula and the reason why we need to have such a strong bilateral relationship. And not only a military relationship, but also economic and diplomatic. So, I also get a sense of concern and trepidation from my meetings with South Korean officials in Seoul, and I just got back yesterday from another trip. So they do have some questions, concerns that once North Korea achieves the ability to hit the U.S. with a nuclear weapon, that there may be a decoupled alliance and that the U.S. may not live up to our obligations to defend them. Alternatively, there's also a concern that the Trump administration may reach a bilateral agreement with North Korea, thus leaving South Korea out in the cold, sort of like during the agreed framework, where afterwards Seoul complained that we were negotiating their security over their heads without them in the room. So what we have is really, I think by word and deed, North Korea has shown that it has no intention of abandoning its nuclear weapons, that Pyongyang has made clear in both its public statements and private meetings with U.S. officials and former officials, and I've engaged in some meetings with North Koreans, that denuclearization is off the table. And as they told me, you can either, you must accept us as a nuclear state, and then we're either ready to talk about a peace treaty or fight. So the message is quite clear from North Korea. So as I said, because of this, South Korea fears a decoupling and that we may not come to their aid. And I take exception to that because I try to point out to my Korean friends and colleagues that, of course we have the Mutual Defense Treaty, so we're obligated to do that. But beyond that, we've had a number of presidential statements and senior official, U.S. official statements pledging our commitment. And of course, we have the shared history of bloodshed during the Korean War. But I also think and would emphasize that most significantly, the U.S. has committed its most precious resource, really the lives of our sons and daughters in uniform, that we've placed in harm's way to stand shoulder to shoulder with South Korea to defend them against the North Korean threat. And those of us with children in the U.S. military, and my son is a United States Marine who just recently returned from service in Afghanistan, the parents do not make that commitment lightly, but we do so to defend freedom and democracy, not only in the United States, but overseas with our allies. And if you go out onto the mall and you see the Korean War Memorial, it really is a very somber reminder of the tragic events during 1950 to 1953. And the inscription, it honors those who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. Well, South Korea and its people are very well known to Americans now, and we will be there for you. And because yesterday, today, and tomorrow, it will remain, we go together. Kachi kapshida. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our conference today. So if I could get our panelists up. Yeah. So we're very lucky to have both U.S. and Korean experts, two each. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Lee-Hoo Chol, who's a professor of China and International Studies at Incheon National University. He's the director of the Institute of China Studies, as well as the president of the Korean Association of International Studies. And then we will hear from Dr. Kim Jong-un, Senior Research Fellow at INSS. He's also a Central Committee member at the National Unification Advisory Council and the Executive Committee member of the Korean Association of International Studies. And then we'll hear from Elizabeth Rosenberg, a Senior Fellow and Director of Energy, Economics, and the Security Program at the Center for New American Security. And before there, she worked at the Treasury Department as Senior Advisor to the Department and to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then also to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. So in those positions, she helped to develop and implement financial and energy sanctions, including key initiatives to tighten global sanctions on Iran, Libya, and Syria, as well as Burma. And then finally, batting cleanup is going to be Anthony Ruggiero, a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And before that, he spent 17 years in the U.S. government at both the Treasury and State Departments. At Treasury, he was Deputy Director and then Director of the Office of Global Affairs in the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. And before that, at State Department, he was Chief of the Defensive Measures and the WMD Finance Team, and was also an advisor to the U.S. delegation at the six-party talks. And one thing I don't think I knew until I was looking at the biography is that we are both graduates of the National War College. So I hadn't realized that. So beat ICAF, go Warriors. So if I could turn to Dr. Yi first to give his remarks.
Thank you, Bruce. Here at the worldwide recognized prestigious Heritage Foundation, I feel very honored to address some key issues of the Moon Jae-in government foreign policies and security policies.
Sorry, is the microphone on?
It should be, they're all live. No, they're all live. That maybe just speak up a little louder.
In the midst of increasing North Korean nuclear and missile crisis, since Moon Jae-in government launched last May 10, my talks will focus on the security issues caused by the North Korean nuclear and missile crisis. And my talks are based on what I understand about the issues, not on any official position of the Korean government. I believe the Moon Jae-in government has come into office with some visions, ambitious visions for its own foreign policies and national security. In my understanding, they are, first, peaceful coexistence of North and South Korea, moving ultimately toward reunification. Second, reshaping the Korean Peninsula into a platform of peace and prosperity connected to Eurasia and Asia Pacific. Third, turning Northeast Asia into a hub of peace and prosperity with trade, investment, energy, transportation, and supply chains interconnected within the region. Finally, building a strong and responsible defense posture within the U.S.-Korea alliance framework and with its own advances and upgrade of military capabilities. Within these visions, the Moon Jae-in government is trying to realize a denuclearized peace as a key goal of foreign and security policies under current circumstances. A denuclearized peace will be achieved by both denuclearization of North Korea and conversion of the armistice into a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. I believe related countries, including the US, China, Russia, and Japan, all certainly share this goal as an ultimate solution of the current nuclear and missile crisis caused by North Korea, even though they may differ in their estimation of the feasibility of the goal. For North Korea, however, its ultimate goal could be a nuclearized peace, where North Korea maintains nuclear post against the US and other major powers. Then the key task of 5 countries is to change Kim Jong-un's calculus, by which he comes to recognize that denuclearized peace is more sustainable and secure for his regime than the other way. Maximum pressure and the UN sanctions should be targeted toward this direction. Then, how we approach toward this goal of denuclearized peace in the Korean Peninsula. President Trump announced the maximum pressure and engagement as a basic strategy of North Korea policy in last April. This policy aims to mobilize maximum pressure to North Korea so as to engage North Korea not to have nuclear weapons. President Moon Jae-in also has remarked several times his approach as sanctions and press for dialogue. I believe both approaches are basically in accord. Sanctions and press by themselves may not lead to regime change or regime collapse, neither to giving up of nuclear weapons. However, they could change Kim Jong-un's calculus on developing nuclear weapons. To be effective, therefore, sanctions and press may have to last consistently until North Korea is persuaded to sit at negotiation table. Secondary sanctions of the US, I believe, will increase the effectiveness of the sanctions by making possible a more global participation in the UN sanctions. In the meantime, South Korea will face serious security threat by North Korean nuclear and missile weapons. South Korea could conceivably consider about 3 options to counteract the North Korean threat. First one would be a developing nuclear weapons by its own capabilities. Second, bringing back tactical nuclear weapons of the US.
And the third is strengthening visibly extended deterrence. Any option would have to be closely coordinated within the U.S.-Korea alliance. But I think at this time, strengthening extended deterrence would be the most feasible option until any solution is agreed on at the negotiation with North Korea. On the other hand, I suggest that a multilateral approach with 5 countries should be seriously considered in dealing with the North Korean nuclear and missile crisis. The 5 will agree on denuclearization, endorse security of North Korean regime, and strive jointly to bring North Korea to negotiation table and find out necessary measures to conclude the negotiation with North Korea. This 5+1 approach will diffuse unnecessary tensions and raise feasibility of a peaceful resolution of the crisis. If this multilateral approach succeeds in dealing with the crisis, it would further evolve into an organization for security cooperation in Northeast Asia. China especially needed to recognize exactly what China would face if it tolerates North Korea's probable insistence to nuclearize the peace. Then South Korea cannot but balance against North Korea's nuclear threat for its own deterrence in whatever manner, as Mao Zedong China did during the Cold War. Therefore, denuclearize the peace is the best solution for China too. What would happen in the near future? First, let's consider about the worst scenario. It would be like this. North Korea's clear threat to the U.S. or its allies, and the U.S. military reaction escalating into a war. This scenario will cause devastating damages and casualties to South Korea and probably Japan and outlying territories in the Pacific of the U.S. But North Korea would be totally destroyed or may not exist after war. I think this scenario nobody wants to see. What would be the best scenario? It is likely to be a negotiation either between the U.S. and North Korea or among 4, North and South Korea, U.S. and China, or 6, including Russia and Japan. Start where denuclearized peace is agreed on and regime security of North Korea is guaranteed with the necessary measures concluded. The key question here is whether Kim Jong-un is willing to give up its nuclear and missile weapons even with the regime security guaranteed. North Korea may insist a nuclearized peace with the U.S. Then the reality might be in between the best and the worst scenario. The U.S., South Korea, and Japan will maximize the sanctions and pressures while seeking for a negotiated solution with North Korea. China and Russia will join the sanctions, but not actively. Even if negotiation begins, North Korea is more likely to insist its nuclear power status and a peace treaty with the U.S., while South Korea and Japan might consider nuclear balance against the North Korean nuclear threat. This reality might go on for considerable time of period. Nevertheless, a denuclearized peace should be the ultimate goal in dealing with current North Korean nuclear and missile crisis. Then what should be done toward the ultimate goal of a denuclearized peace on the Korean Peninsula? First, the U.S.-Korea alliance should be strengthened in order to deal North Korean nuclear and missile threat in a close coordination and to reassure South Korean security, even if whatever measures decided against North Korean threat. Second, South Korea should make a policy package for the ultimate goal in close consultations with the US and China and try to lead its implementation. Third, sanctions and pressures should be implemented in a concerted way to compel Kim Jong-un to come to negotiation table. China and Russia should be persuaded to take an active part in implementing the sanctions unless they want to see an unstable nuclear balance on the Korean Peninsula and potential nuclearization of Japan. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Kim?
All right. Before I begin, I want to thank the Heritage Foundation, especially Bruce, for hosting this event. If you knew the process, it wasn't quite easy, but the blame is on me. But thank you. We are finally here. We are happy to be here. I'm going to focus more on the U.S., South Korea, U.S. bilateral relations. First of all, I want to give you a quick sketch of what's been going on with two countries for the last 10 months or so. And then I would like to touch on some of the practical issues that I believe both countries should deal with. This year, we had not just one, but two new incoming administrations in both countries, and that's very unusual. When new administration comes in, it is expected to make some noises here and there. When you have two of them happening simultaneously, it's going to be making more than noises. The settlement period for the Trump administration in the United States, I wouldn't describe it as an easy process exactly, but the challenge was bigger for the Moon Jae-in administration because when he was elected, that's when he started his term as a president. So he didn't have time to prepare to take over the presidency. Those are major reasons why a lot of foreign policy experts, including myself, expected long and difficult adjustment period for both Trump administration and Moon Jae-in administration. However, as we all know, the bilateral relations under two new presidents have been smooth sailing. Couple of reasons for that. First, soon after President Trump's inauguration, Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson visited U.S. allies, including South Korea, and their visits were interpreted as a strong signal of assurance for U.S. allies. And the U.S.'s gesture was particularly assuring for South Koreans because Republic of Korea has been a frequent subject of then candidate Trump's speech about U.S. allies along with Japan and Germany. Those speeches were rather disturbing. But the gestures made after his election was very reassuring. And secondly, in ROK, also then presidential candidate Moon Jae-in raised many foreign policy issues, and some of them were more controversial than others. One of them was the decision on the THAAD deployment. After election, however, President Moon Jae-in decided to continue with THAAD deployment with proper lawful procedures such as environmental assessment. That decision was a signal that Moon Jae-in administration is going to honor alliance's decision. The summit meeting between two new presidents, which took place in late June, also helped to consolidate their relations. Two new presidents sending each other the right signal at the right moment in a right way helped to build trust in their relations. And there is a third person who actually contributed more to the strong bilateral relations than those two presidents, and I believe that person is Kim Jong-un. DPRK was no exception in anticipating an easy adjustment period between two countries, and they were quick to milk this opportunity. Kim Jong-un has launched missiles over 20 times this year, including the launch of Hwasong-14 twice in July, and let's not forget the nuclear test. Sure, he has many purposes of upping the level of threat, but one major reason is that to rattle the alliance so that he can manipulate us and benefit from that. It's DPRK's traditional approach to the ROK-US alliance, which I describe as divide and manipulate, splitting two countries and manipulate the alliance so that they could benefit from the estranged relations. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. This time, contrary to Kim Jong-un's expectations, the challenge from DPRK has brought two countries closer together and even facilitated cooperation between two new administrations. The Moon Jae-in administration and the Trump administration have cooperated with each other through bilateral and multilateral means to deter DPRK. So the bilateral relations is off to a good start so far, I would say. But more challenges are on the way. Certainly, DPRK is the biggest challenge and most pressing issue, but there are other issues that require significant policy coordination efforts from both countries. Before I get into that, allow me to spend a little bit of time to explain what policy coordination means in the international context. Because I think policy coordination is a term often misused and misunderstood. It is not about two or more countries having an identical view or identical position on certain issues. Practically, it's impossible. It is about planning a strategy to achieve their shared policy goal. First step of policy coordination is recognizing that your counterparts cannot read your mind, and then talk to each other, and more importantly, listen to each other, so that you can understand the differences. Then you see what you can do to come up with a plan to manage the differences, and you ask your counterparts to do the same. So you come up with a management plan based on your mutual understanding. If that plan doesn't work, what you need to do is go back to the first step and repeat the process until you come up with a plan that's working. And that's what I mean by policy coordination in the international relations context. Now, coming back to what I was talking about, the ROK and the U.S. relations, they've been partners in building and managing regional as well as global order since the World War II. Two countries have been through many challenges and serious crises together. Two countries have a rich network of communication channels born out of decades of shared history. From 6 decades of partnership, two countries have learned many lessons about how to manage the relations better, and we have worked hard to consolidate those communication channels to maintain strong bilateral relations. The thing is, though, those communication networks are in place, but the people at the both ends of the channels are new at the job. It happens in democracies because people come and people go, just like what we are seeing now. Communications and cooperation require practice. It takes time for those people to get used to what they are supposed to do. So we should give them time to sort out what and how they should do their job. In order to do that, we need to utilize all the channels at various levels. Also, the manner of communication matters. Both governments have delicate policy agendas that they want to advance, and that's perfectly normal in international relations, even within an alliance. But the manner of handling those delicate issues matter, especially given that both administrations are under high level of stress. The way they communicate could change things. So both governments should work together to find a common ground based on mutual respect. Now let's talk about more practical issues. First and foremost, again, DPRK. When dealing with DPRK, I believe teamwork is all that matters. ROK and the United States must understand that dealing with DPRK is a team sport and need to consult with each other every step of the way. If you don't play along with your teammate, you don't win in team sports. DPRK will try to do anything to separate us and manipulate us. We should not let them to create conflicts between ROK and US. We should let them know the deal they are getting is buy one, get one free. When they are dealing with one of us, they are dealing with all of us. When Kim Jong-un realizes that he is up against the strongest alliance ever, he will eventually come to senses and understand that talking to us is the only way out for him. Secondly, both countries need to draw more comprehensive DPRK grand strategy. That grand strategy should include both pressure side as well as engagement side. As a matter of fact, I think strategizing engagement side is much more difficult. We have seen enough failures on that front. So that's why we need more meticulous planning, which involves various levels of people from both ROK and the US working together. What we are doing here is a good example of what I'm just suggesting. Besides dealing with the DPRK, there are other things we can do to build stronger relations. Expansion of cooperative relations, such as strengthening trilateral relations among US, Japan, and ROK is one way to do it. Bilateral relations can grow stronger within proper multilateral settings. Trilateral relations among three countries, I think, provide a highly nurturing environment to develop strong bilateral relations. And this week in Seoul, Ministry of Foreign Affairs held a strategic dialogue with US Deputy Secretary of State John Sullivan. Also, Japanese Foreign Affairs Vice Minister Shinsuke Segiyama is in Seoul for a trilateral strategic dialogue with the US and ROK, as well as a bilateral dialogue with South Korea. At the same time, representatives of the six-party talks from US, Japan, and Korea are gathered in Seoul to discuss trilateral cooperation regarding nuclear issues. And Korean government is looking to include China and Russia in that discussion in near future. So on that regard, I think we are also off to a good start. We need to continue this effort and expand the scope of cooperation. We should also look beyond the trilateral relations. As I just suggested, we need to work together to find an angle to include China and Russia in an effort to bring stability in the region. Having more involvement from both countries can create positive dynamics among regional actors, and it will also certainly have implications for DPRK. Finally, I believe sharing long-term vision is fundamental element in building strong, strong bilateral relations. We are in the middle of systemic change of global order and the center of gravity tilting toward Asia. And ROK in the US should share their vision for the future and find a way to build the future together. The future of the Korean Peninsula, future of the Northeast Asia, and future of the global order. We need to take dynamic approach in preparing for that future. What do I mean by dynamic approach? Things change, people change, and geopolitical environment that we are in changes all the time. The bilateral relations between ROK and the US now is different from what it was 60-something years ago. The relations have become strong by adapting to those changes. The relationship has evolved through adaptation. We should keep adapting to those changes. What we mean by strong relations today is not going to be the same in the 10 years from now, in 20 years from now. We cannot stop those changes, but we can adapt to those changes. We should constantly define and redefine ourselves and reinvent our relations so that we could maintain our strong relations regardless of what it means in different contexts, in different times. So bottom line is that relations evolve through dialogues. Cooperative relations thrive on mutual respect and mutual understanding. I would like to wrap up my segment with President Moon Jae-in's message. I happened to have a chance to speak to him when he came back from New York, where he attended a UN General Assembly. I told him that I'm coming to this event, and I asked him if he has any messages that he wants me to convey. Here's his message. By the way, he spoke to me in Korean. I'm just translating. It is unfortunate that the situation of the Korean Peninsula has become worse, and peace and stability of the Korean Peninsula is at danger. Strong languages have made many of us worried about the future of the peninsula. We must understand no one will benefit from militarized conflict in the peninsula. We must do everything we can to prevent any kind of militarized conflict and resolve this crisis in a peaceful manner. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just one thing I'd add to Dr. Kim is when you said that in establishing the bilateral relations, it's difficult when people are new in the job. I just add it's even more difficult when you have people not in the job, which has been a problem on the U.S. side. And we're hoping that perhaps the upcoming trip by President Trump will sort of stimulate actually filling in some of the jobs, such as ambassador to South Korea and assistant secretaries for East Asia at both state and defense. So we're hoping it's a catalyst for that. So Elizabeth?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bruce, and thanks also to INSS and to Heritage. It's a pleasure to be with you all. It's a little difficult to follow the remarks of the President. Nevertheless, I will try and offer you all something to think about here from the U.S. side. And I thought I would start with a brief summary of the sanctions on North Korea, the United States, and the international regime in order to set a context for part of the conversation about the broader pressure strategy, pressure and engagement with regard to North Korea, and also the coordination between the United States and South Korea when it comes to North Korea policy and sanctions in particular. So speaking briefly about the North Korea sanctions regime, the current regime against North Korea has been in place for about a decade, and until last year, it focused quite narrowly on targeting proliferation materials and networks, as well as financing for such proliferation activities. But last year, in response to provocations, which have been mentioned already, the United States and the UN imposed sanctions that expanded the focus to economic sectors and more generalized effort to sever commercial trade and deprive North Korea of hard currency. And these measures prohibit both the purchase of North Korean goods, including coal, metals, seafood, textiles, the employment of North Korean laborers overseas, as well as sanctions on the exportation to North Korea of certain goods. The most recent United States sanctions also impose a cap on oil sales to North Korea and a major reduction in the sale of refined products and condensate into North Korea. In the United States in particular, speaking specifically about the United States as a leader on North Korea sanctions, there's been a more aggressive enforcement posture recently. The use of law enforcement tools to go after, in addition to North Korean entities, those entities outside of North Korea, such as in China and in Russia, that have been providing front companies, shell companies, and otherwise proxies for North Koreans engaged in proliferation and other economic activity. Previously, before this most recent push on enforcement, there had been a reluctance in the United States to target and expose Chinese entities acting on behalf of North Korean entities for a variety of intelligence and political reasons, but particularly this administration has taken quite a different view on that, and the enforcement posture has therefore been more aggressive recently. And I think we will expect that to continue. Last month, the United States imposed, you may have noticed this, a very aggressive and unusually far-reaching new secondary sanctions authorities in an executive order. It allows the United States Treasury to suspend U.S. correspondent account access to any foreign bank that knowingly conducts or facilitates significant transactions tied to trade with North Korea or designated entities. And it allows the United States to enforce United Nations sanctions, essentially, by giving the United States authorities to target anyone working with or for North Korea with regard to goods, services, and technology, and ban them from interacting with the United States financial system, which is indeed a harsh penalty. And the U.S. can also block and freeze assets of actors supporting North Korea's textile, fishing, IT, manufacturing industries. And in addition, these new authorities go after North Korea's shipping networks and ports. This is is and should be perceived as a major shot across the bow and targeting China as a strong declaratory policy of itself and signaling to China that the United States expects, hopes, encourages, demands that China do more to prevent North Korea's use of Chinese companies and its financial system to engage in proliferation activities and other economic activities. Of course, China represents the overwhelming majority of, or rather facilitates and engages with North Korea for the overwhelming amount of its foreign trade. And that's all I'll say about the sanctions to date. We would be happy to discuss them more in questions, and I think Anthony will talk a little bit more about sanctions going forward. I wanted to make a couple of other comments about international coordination on North Korea sanctions, and specifically United States and South Korea coordination in this domain. Of course, coordination is fundamentally important. Sanctions must be multilateral to be effective, both economically and for signaling coherence, as well as to avoid having security partners be divided and manipulated. And this is true not just in the case of North Korea, but more broadly. Also, and as has already been mentioned, I view it as significantly important that North Korea sanctions be coordinated and such that allies have shared or complementary goals that can be acknowledged and worked into the strategy for the deployment of sanctions. In the United States-South Korea relationship, it's not hard to coordinate these sanctions that pressure North Korea. The goal is to increase or maximize pressure on North Korea. This is a one-directional ramp for sanctions. It is, however, and I should say that there's been excellent coordination that has been clearly evidenced in the sanctions policy that's come forward over the last year or two in the United States, at the United Nations, and more broadly as a measure of policy. It is in the area of engagement, potential engagement with North Korea, including to the extent of negotiations where coordination over sanctions becomes much more difficult. And perhaps it is forward-looking or optimistic to explore what the challenges of coordination in that area. But I would like to touch on a few points in this domain. So first of all, as one of the challenges that may exist in coordination over North Korea sanctions, is there agreement on what political or security outcomes sanctions leverage should be used to achieve? And as I said, when the effort is to expand pressure, that's not necessarily so difficult to coordinate and to find agreement on. But so that is to say, the ultimate objective there may be agreement on. But when you're talking about the sequencing and the priorities of removal of certain sanctions in exchange for concessions on the part of North Korea, there may be quite significant differences that exist. For example, considering whether relief of sanctions should be front-loaded in response to concessions on the part of North Korea, whether there should be a near-term priority towards de-escalation, or rather should the ultimate objective be the guiding principle for removing sanctions, a kind of small for small or big for big. These are methodological challenges of coordinating economic statecraft. Again, they're not specific to North Korea, but you can see how in this instance, given the stakeholder interests of a variety of parties, the United States and its close allies, these are significant challenges and will no doubt require a lot of time and attention in order to have the United States and its allies working together. I'll also point out that it is the United States that has a strong degree of economic leverage when it comes to pressuring North Korea through the ties that it does have, as well as China, to indirectly pressure North Korea. And there's no mechanism or automaticity to ensure that the United States coordinate closely with its security partners, South Korea and others, in exercise of this pressure, which can be awkward in the instance of engagement, less so now when goals are so significantly aligned around expanding pressure. But it's certainly something to keep in mind, because the parties, I think, ought to be ready to take yes for an answer if there is an opportunity for appropriate concessions and movement towards a goal, ultimate goals here. A second area of challenges in sanctions coordination I wanted to raise is one that is more generalized, although in the specific case of the United States and South Korea, I think we have a slightly different case. But as a general matter, there is a perceived and actual predisposition, a belief in the predisposition of the U.S. administration towards international coordination, nuclear diplomacy, and its bandwidth to engage in international engagements where there's such that there's skepticism about U.S. commitments to foreign allies, the necessity for reassurance, belief that the United States administration has its own skepticism toward multilateral security arrangements of many varieties, and its interest in engaging in nuclear diplomacy. So whether or not this administration intended to, of course, it has fostered this lack of confidence that I've suggested. And in the eyes of President Trump, these may be misreadings, of course, of his policy, and furthermore may have no bearing on the U.S. and South Korea relationship. But nevertheless, this engendered anxiety about U.S. commitments internationally, its willingness to scrap multilateral security frameworks, and its ultimate aims for its role in the Asia-Pacific have clearly require attention. And the U.S. has surely been working to ameliorate many of these concerns with regard to South Korea and in the Asia-Pacific. But as Bruce just mentioned, when there are fewer diplomats to do that and many posts left unfilled, then that can create an environment where there may be episodic or uneven engagement with even the closest security allies. That's surely a challenging environment in which to have significant confidence building and extensive policy coordination around even our most significant threats. A third challenge that I wanted to highlight in international coordination on North Korea sanctions has to do with what I would characterize as a growing power struggle between the U.S. Congress and the U.S. administration over the exercise of foreign policy. We've seen the U.S. Congress take a stronger role on a number of foreign policy issues in this administration, certainly including sanctions. And that may have less to do with substance and more to do with degree or pride of authorship, if you will. And on North Korea, surely there's a lot of agreement between Congress and the administration about the direction for this policy. But as in the case of pride of authorship or congressional oversight of the administration, it creates a dynamic which may make it difficult to coordinate a North Korea policy broadly and sanctions more specifically with allies. When Congress engages in the kind of legislative efforts to, what I would say, tie the hands of the administration on sanctions and remove its ability to act without the approval of Congress, it makes it more difficult to coordinate with allies and to, should the opportunity arise, engage in the rollback of sanctions in exchange for concessions on the part of North Korea. So that's an obvious structural challenge for the advancement of this policy. And finally, to wrap up, I will just note that the remedy for a number of these challenges is obviously to continue coordinating and communicating between the United States and its closest allies. They must, as has been mentioned, bear each other's goals in mind and find a way to accommodate or acknowledge them in order to achieve a good mutual outcome. When it comes to that principle in foreign policy making on North Korea, I think there's more of a predisposition to consider how the United States should bear in mind China's security and foreign policy objectives in order to find a way to, in some way, address or perhaps accommodate them based on a belief that China will not capitulate to United States security interests when it comes to pressuring North Korea. But of course, let it not go unsaid that the United States must find a way to acknowledge and accommodate and coordinate with its own closest allies, such as South Korea and others, when it comes to finding a path forward for the policy on North Korea, including sanctions. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Anthony.
Great, thank you. Anthony?
Thank you. Thank you to INSS and the Heritage Foundation for this event. As was mentioned, we're in a very dangerous situation with North Korea's provocations, whether it's their ICBMs or their nuclear weapons program. One of the important elements of sanctions policy is the coordination of the United States, South Korea, and Japan. And it certainly seems like those coordination efforts are underway. So what I decided, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the two policy paths that are emerging, at least from the view here in the United States, and then I'm going to say one quick word about Iran and North Korea, because that's always in the news. So the two policy paths that certainly looks like it's emerging are this concept of deterrence as a policy, and coupled with that would be, negotiating a freeze again with North Korea, a freeze of its nuclear weapons and missile programs. There's been a lot of back and forth on, can we deter North Korea? Can we not deter North Korea? Haven't we been deterring North Korea for 60 years? From my perspective, the issue with deterrence, of course, is, what are you trying to deter? Are you trying to deter North Korea from another Korean war? I think we can certainly be successful at that, and we have been successful at that. Or are we trying to deter North Korea from the provocations, from things that are contrary to the interests of the United States and our allies? And the history there, even recent history, shows that part of deterrence, if that's what people are saying, has failed. For example, North Korea built a nuclear reactor in Syria that was destroyed by Israel in 2007. If that happened again and our policy was deterrence, would we, slap ourselves on the back and say, well, of course deterrence has succeeded? And of course we wouldn't do that. So I think we have to be careful about how we extend deterrence or talk about deterrence. And on a freeze, I think we have to, remember our history here, that a freeze does not reduce the threat from North Korea, and it does not stop the programs. This ICBM program did not start yesterday. This thermonuclear weapons program did not start yesterday. North Korea is never going to be ready to negotiate a freeze that will have the level of verification necessary to ensure that research and development on these problematic weapons programs cease during a freeze. And that is the critical problem with a freeze. So obviously I don't like this path. The other path right now, sort of short-term, medium path, is sanctions. And what are we, what is the administration trying to do in that path? I think what they're looking at is the Iran sanctions playbook, which even the critics and supporters of the Iran nuclear deal agree that sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table. And what is the key element of that, or was it, and now is developing on North Korea, is you have to make a choice. Businesses, companies, banks all have to make a choice. North Korea or the United States? Do you want to trade with the $19 trillion economy, or do you want to trade with North Korea? And what's being reported is that clearly over 20 countries have stopped diplomatic relationships and or commercial relationship, or downgraded diplomatic relationships, I should say. So that certainly seems like there's some success there. But what parts of sanctions do we need to focus on here? So I've done some research. I've published it in different places. The question of, is North Korea the most sanctioned country in the world? The answer is no. It's at best fourth. But putting aside those numbers, what we need to really focus on is North Korea's overseas network, right? Their overseas business network. We need to focus on the non-North Koreans that are facilitating this sanctions evasion. And so going back to March 31st of this year, which was the first sanction by this administration, the Trump administration has, and these are the only numbers I'm going to use in the presentation, the Trump administration, 80.5% of its designations or sanctions focused on North Korea's international business network. That's good. That's the good number. But only 27.3% were focused or targeted non-North Koreans. So that's the not so great number. And if you're wondering, in terms of looking at the sanctions overall, the U.S. sanctions, only 53.6% target North Korea's international business network, and only 15.1% target non-North Koreans. So obviously we have some work to do there. So what do we need to do? We need to do more, obviously. One of the things we need to do is we need to sanction Chinese medium and large banks And we need to go after all of the Chinese networks that are helping North Korea. And when I say going after banks, I know there are a lot of people out there who, like to talk about, well, we should, freeze the assets of Bank of China or cut them off from the U.S. financial system. While I certainly don't rule out that might have to be an option down the road, the United States government issued fines against European financial institutions for Iran sanctions between 2012 and 2015 to the tune of $12 billion. I'm not saying we have to go to that level, but we may have to. I think Chinese banks are going to need a little push. The other thing we need to focus on is the shipping network, the shipping fleet. That's something that we're looking at more and more, and I can tell you that every day we look at it, we find something new, because the North Koreans are very good. I mean, what we're seeing is what the North Koreans are doing in their commercial and financial sector. In other words, using Chinese front companies and middlemen, Chinese, Hong Kong, and others. We see that in the shipping sector, which is not surprising. And the third thing I would recommend that we work on is, what I've talked about a lot is the like-minded group. It could be UK, France, Germany, South Korea, Japan, Australia initially, and that group should get together. They can do a variety of things. Policy coordination could be one of them. On sanctions coordination, my favorite example is shipping. The UN shipping sanctions say you need reasonable grounds to investigate a vessel, which suggests, when you read it, that suggests that you have to have intelligence that that particular vessel is doing something wrong. But given North Korea's history, where they hide things under sugar shipments and iron ore before it was restricted, the like-minded group could say, we're using that UN sanction and we're turning it on its head. And we're saying every North Korean-linked vessel, there is reasonable grounds for inspections. That would be, in my view, one way to go. One thing, the fourth thing I would mention is, making sure we remember North Korea's human rights situation. I think that, we have forgotten what the Committee of Inquiry did in 2014, recommending that North Korea be referred to the ICC or its own tribunal. That should come back. China should be forced to veto that in the Security Council, and I personally would like to see the Security Council go beyond what they've done on overseas laborers. I think they've made some important steps, but saying that revenue goes to the nuclear weapons and missile programs and then capping that revenue at its current level does not make a lot of sense, because you're saying it's going to the weapons program, that should be going down to zero. Not capped at the current level. So I just want to make one comment on Iran. There's a lot of ink that is spilled on the Trump administration's actions on the Iran nuclear deal will harm our ability to get a nuclear deal with North Korea. I think the people who say that obviously don't have a lot of experience with North Korea, given our prior history. And I would also say that North Korea is not exactly waiting by the phone for a nuclear weapons deal with the United States. The other thing I would say is that it does not focus on the correct problem here when you're looking at Iran and North Korea. The concern I have is that there are too many people, pundits and other folks, maybe former government officials, that are comfortable with stating that we cannot achieve denuclearization with North Korea, and that what we should just accept, going back to my first point, is deterrence and a freeze of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Just think of what message that sends to Iran. The message that sends to Iran is that, in 10, 20 years, you could have your own nuclear weapons program too, and this is the path. North Korea is laying out the path. So I think we have to be careful, who is looking at whom. Is it North Korea is looking at Iran, or is it Iran looking at North Korea? And with that, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, thank you. 4 very good presentations. So we'll open. Yeah. So we'll open the floor to questions. We have some microphones ready to help. If you could just identify your name, affiliation if you have one, and then a short question, and if you can direct it to any of the specific panelists, otherwise just sort of throw it open to the panel. So, Did we stump the audience? Oh, I'm right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Andreas Ross with the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. My question is directed to the two panelists from South Korea, and I would like to ask you to comment a little more specifically on some of the more controversial things the American president has done and said about this issue recently. I'm thinking, obviously, about the fire and fury threat, the undercutting of his own foreign secretary by saying he's wasting his time, the wording of little rocket man, also the timing of the threat about the trade agreement with South Korea on a very hot day in the conflict, and maybe lastly also what Anthony referred to, his posture to the Iran agreement. So my question to you would be, you've mentioned many things that on substance are really going in an aligned way. What, if any, of those aspects are worrying you particularly, or do you think make a solution harder or even easier? If you could comment on these, thank you.
Thank you for your question. So your question is the wording war between two President Trump and Kim Jong-un. How do I worry most? That is your question, right?
Yeah, the different things I mentioned are all, I think, separate issues. Undercutting his own foreign secretary. I mean, basically, yes, it is mostly words. And what, if any, of these things worry you, or do you think are harming the cause?
About the North Korean nuclear issue, I worry most. No war. War should not occur. Not any more Korean war again. That not just me, but most Korean people living in South Korea, they are worried this crisis should be resolved peacefully and diplomatically. That's also what I worry. Second, South Korea cannot live with North Korean nuclear weapons. So, in whatever manner, North Korea should be denuclearized. So these two things are what I am most worried about, and that also might be the same for most of Korean people.
If I answer your question, well, it's true that many of the things said and done by President Trump and Kim Jong-un has raised the concerns over the Korean Peninsula. But if you think of the every attempt we made with DPRK, it's all failed. Now it's time to try new things. And what we are witnessing is trying new things with President Trump and with President Moon Jae-in. Like I said in his message, President Moon Jae-in plays a more calm and stable role, while President Trump is more aggressive and unorthodox role that we are not used to. Since you are from Germany, let's use soccer reference. You can't all be defenders or goalie or attackers. We have to divide the role to win the game. And what we are seeing with two countries is exactly that, I believe. So I'm not really concerned about the wars, but like I said in my presentation, we need to consult every and each step of the way to know that where your teammates are and what kind of role the other teammates is playing. Thank you.
Thank you. I like how you tailored the sports analogy to the question. I was doing a BBC radio interview, and they were talking about should we intercept a North Korean missile, and I was pointing out that by the time a North Korean missile gets over Japan, it's higher than the capability of even the SM-3. So here I am talking to a British audience. I said, well, you know, a shortstop can say he's going to catch all the balls to the outfield, but they're, you know, over his head. And they're like, oh, well, thank you. I don't think our audience understands a baseball analogy, but thank you anyway. Like, great. I couldn't think of a cricket analogy, so anyway. Right here. Right down in front. We get a couple kind of in a row here.
Thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. One thing we never talked about, and I have a crazy idea, and I want to ask. I've been kicking around with this idea. While sanctions, the effect of it takes a little while to go in effect. Maybe 12 months. Some people say, some experts say it may take 12 months to really feel for North Korea to feel the pinching. Speaking of nuclear, 1991, we had a nuclear weapon in South Korea. 1991, they took it back. So my question is, maybe you can answer, should we give it back? Because we already installed a THAAD system in South Korea. So my question is, what's next? You know, in my mind, that's where I go. Somebody, maybe Dr. Lee mentioned it a little bit, maybe, but that's my question.
Okay, maybe I'll field that one and others can jump in. I just had an article in The Diplomat about that. Yeah, South Korea, because it's, you know, increasingly nervous not only of the North Korean threat, but of whether the U.S. will, you know, stay and fight, you know, has come up with a number of new military proposals, or maybe not new, reintroducing U.S. tactical nukes, which were removed in the 90s, South Korea going nuclear, you know, building a 3,000-ton submarine, more permanent deployments or rotations of U.S. strategic assets, et cetera. I think a lot of them, or most of them, are based on the South Korean concern rather than military sense. If you look at, you know, the reintroducing U.S. TAC nukes, it really doesn't make military sense. The ground things that we took out in 1991, they no longer exist. And the other tactical nuclear weapons that are on subs and ships are on very hard-to-find platforms. Even if the platforms themselves aren't stealthy, they are very hard to find and thus target by North Korea. So by reintroducing TAC nukes, what you're doing is you're taking them off of the hard-to-find platforms and moving them into easy-to-find bunkers in South Korea. So you've degraded Allied military capabilities. It's like all the police patrolmen walking out in the neighborhoods telling them to empty the bullets out of their pistol and put all the bullets back at headquarters. Well, now they're defenseless, and then if you do have a crisis, you all need to run to headquarters, grab your bullets, and go back to where you were before. The same with the TAC nukes, is if they're in a bunker, you have to go and take the time to get them back to where they are now. So you've degraded deterrent and defense capabilities. You've also increased the potential or likelihood of a preemptive North Korean attack because you now have this big, juicy, hit-me-here bunker where North Korea may feel, if I can take out that high-value target, I've really degraded Allied capabilities to defend themselves. You may also feel constrained during a crisis to take them out from the bunker, just as we often have hesitated to do a NEO, evacuation of non-emergency personnel, taking out the civilians during a crisis. We think it would just be a defensive measure, but the concern has been North Korea would see it as we are doing that as a precursor to us attacking. So there are times we have not been evacuating our citizens during a crisis because we're fearful it will precipitate the crisis we're trying to prevent. Even more so, I think, with nuclear weapons. You take them out of the bunkers, North Korea will feel you're about to attack. So, you know, really, as I said before in the remarks, is, you know, we have a treaty. We're obligated to defend Korea. We've, you know, had all these presidential signals of resolve. We have the history of the Korean War, which Americans do not forget. And we've got 28,500 sons and daughters, and hundreds of thousands more are pledged during a crisis. So the presence of a few nuclear weapons can't be any stronger of a signal of our resolve than having our forces there. So I think there really is no reason for that, for putting them in there, other than to reassure Korea. And, you know, to be honest, it's an unquenchable thirst. It's like a bucket that you're trying to fill when there's a hole in the side of it. Even if we put in TAC nukes, there would be something else Korea would want to prove that we are committed. And it's something that really is more a matter of trust than of gadgets. So, okay, we'll just kind of go right up the line here.
My name is Wayne Balls. I'm president of the Balls Company. In March of '94, I was privileged to go to visit South Korea as a delegation sponsored by the ASEAN Foundation. And my heart hurts bad for those people that are imprisoned by that thug in those gulags in North Korea. And my question is, and Anthony, you touched on it, why couldn't we do a complete economic quarantine of North Korea? We get our allies to put their ships, no ships in, no ships out, and starve them out, and would that work?
Well, I think with an economic quarantine or some kind of effort to close North Korea completely off, I mean, I think the Chinese would have a say in that. I think that we're getting closer and closer toward that if we're on a spectrum, right? I think Liz put it best, where we started with the focus on WMD, and that extended to commodities, and now we're extending it to completely cutting off some other areas of revenue. I think right now the focus is on, how do you get the Chinese to do more on North Korea? And there are some who believe, and frankly have believed for 10 years, that there's a way to have a cooperative relationship with China to get them to do more. There are some of us who've been saying for 10 years that that's not going to work. And I think this administration, again, as Liz pointed out, is the only one so far that has really started to push that. I mean, they've had 6 actions from the Justice Department and the Treasury Departments focused on China. And I think they're doing the right thing there, but there needs to be more. It's not clear to me after the issuance of the new executive order why there hasn't been a single non-North Korean designated under that executive order. I understand why they issued the sanctions, basically exposing most of North Korea's financial representatives overseas, 26 persons designated, 19 of which were in China. That's certainly a signal, especially on an executive order where you have a knowingly clause. Secretary Mnuchin, after the executive order was issued, basically said, from this day forward, you cannot claim that you don't know. But we're now, I believe, 3 weeks from that action. I understand the party Congress is almost over, so perhaps we'll finally get some additional actions against China. I think there's also been this issue of resources inside the U.S. government. I'm more optimistic on that. The people I talk to suggest that the level of resources necessary. But to the point of your question, we're nowhere near on shipping where we need to be. I mean, our initial research, which we're still going through, the Treasury Department has sanctioned 40 vessels linked to North Korea. We are tracking 140 vessels, if that gives you any sense of how far we need to come. When I worked on the Iran shipping problem, I had one in the State Department, cooperatively with the Treasury Department. I had one person designated to tracking Iranian vessels. I have no I don't believe that that's happening right now. So before we get to any point where we would be able to have some kind of embargo, we would have to know what vessels are out there, and I'm not confident that we're at that point yet. We're trying to do it internal, you know, sort of as an NGO, but we all need to collectively get there.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that I think Anthony mentioned something along these lines earlier, but if there is a time in the future where such drastic pressure tactics, you were mentioning going after Chinese banks or the Chinese Bank China, right, is appropriate, perhaps there will be that scenario, but there are a number of intermediary escalatory steps to get there. And if you substitute the Bank of China for, as you've suggested, a complete economic embargo on North Korea, some of the intermediate steps to get there would involve not just China, but also a variety of other countries which do have some measure of communication and trade or other contact, tightening that trade to begin to siphon it off. And that's the area where there can and should be much more work and much greater strategy. This administration, the Trump administration, can lead such an effort. There's certainly a lot of interest in doing more there. And I may be joined by some of you in thinking that the time to move forward on that escalatory ladder begins now. It has been the case for a while. But moving from the rung we are now at to that ultimate rung must involve some intermediate steps, escalatory steps.
Okay, I think we had two more here, and then we'll go over there.
Yes, my name is John, and I'm a heritage member of the foundation. My question goes to how much power or how much control does China have over Kim Jong-un? And, you know, is he China's puppet or not? And, you know, I mean, it really goes to the question is what can China really do to diffuse this dangerous situation? And this is directed at the panel.
Okay. Anyone want to? Sure. I mean, I would just say that, you know, I think the Chinese have said often that they have no control over North Korea. The way I look at that is I separate it into two parts, the political part and the economic part. On the political part, it's clear that they have lost whatever access or leverage that they have with North Korea. That happened early on in Kim Jong-un's, you know, dictatorship, whatever you want to call it, when he killed his uncle, Jang Song-taek, who was very close to him, and purged some of the other people associated with that part of the North Korean regime. On the economic side, the Chinese suggesting that is laughable. When you have 85 to 90% of the trade, of North Korea's trade with China, how the Chinese have in the past shown that they can pull some levers. I know it's not that easy, but you know they do certain things and it hurts North Korea. So the Chinese can be better at what they're doing, but I don't have a sense that they you know they don't have anyone waiting in the wings anymore. Now that Kim Jong-nam was assassinated, that was always the rumor that he was their you know, plan C or D, whichever one it was, right? So I think that the Chinese have more they could do. The issue here is that the Chinese really have never shown the ability, whether it's in the North Korea space or the Iran space or other proliferation cases, have never shown the desire to be forward-leaning. They're always like, bring us more information and then maybe we'll act on that. What we need is China to be more forward-leaning. That's why I firmly believe that going after the banks and Chinese banks that see themselves as global banks, they will not like the reputation hit that they will take from significant U.S. sanctions, and that is probably the place to start to get this, you know, ball rolling, to get the Chinese to be more proactive and to do more. But, you know, that's the optimist in me.
Okay, right there.
Hi, Paul Huang, reporter for the Epoch Times. Last week, Lee Chung-hee, a South Korean parliament member, revealed to the public that North Korean hackers are hacking into the South Korean defense data center, stolen a huge cache of top secret military operation plans, including one Operation 5015, which is a joint U.S.-South Korean plan to assassinate Kim Jong-un. And my question is, how could something like this have happened? If this is real, like I don't see any reason to see why it's not, because let's just say the Lee, he's a sitting ranking member of South Korean Parliament's Defense Committee. So pretty much there's a high credibility what he's saying is true. And if this is true, well, we have impact on the confidence of future U.S.-South Korean, any kind of joint operational plan. Because if the plan given to South Korea that's stored in some database, would it be stolen by North Korean hackers just like that? How could we prevent something like this from happening again? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the question. Well, the thing about cybersecurity and cyber hacking is that no matter how well prepared you are, it only takes one mistake, one glitch, and that's it. So it's very difficult to defend the system from cyber hacking activities from originated from North Korea when they are always looking for an opportunity, and it's humans operating all the internet system. And South Korea is, fortunately and unfortunately, has one of the best internet system in the world. So it's easier for cyber hackers to infiltrate it in the system and go around the system. Well, as we have witnessed, there are a lot of known cases like Sony hacking and Malaysian bank hacking that originated from North Korea. So it's not just South Korea's problem, it's more of a global problem. And when it comes to cybersecurity, I think the critical element we need to prepare is sharing information of the activities and sharing, developing a strategy that we can defend ourselves together against North Korea's cyber hacking. And I actually believe that as we impose more and more sanctions on North Korean economic activity and trade activity, they will target more on financial systems rather than security systems, because they need financial flow and they cannot get it from regular ways, legal ways. So we need to develop more secure ways to defend our financial system.
I just add, I was trying to pull up some quotes. There's quotes from a German general during World War II and the Soviet general after that is sort of, it's so tough to fight against the Americans because they never follow their war plans. And that we sort of, seem to emphasize chaos when we're on the battlefield. But I mean, more seriously, as they've said, is that a lot of people just not only underestimate North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities, but also the cyber capabilities. And I remember during the Sony hack, doing interviews where, frequently the interviewer would show the nighttime satellite photo of the peninsula where North Korea can't even keep a light bulb going on. How could they possibly do anything like a cyber hack? And the response is, well, U.S. and South Korean officials have said North Korea is in the top 3 countries in the world in their cyber attack capabilities, so they're very good, even though you think they couldn't possibly do that. So, there's a long list of things. They've done they tried to do a $1 billion bank robbery via, cyber. They got away with $81 million, and then because someone had mistyped, made a few misspellings in the thing, some bank officials were able to stop the rest of the money from going. So North Korea is very good. It is very worrisome that they've been able to hack into government, systems, including apparently the war plan. I do note, though, that the Pentagon sort of had a different assessment than South Korea had, sort of saying it wasn't as serious a breach as some were making it out to be. I don't know the reality, but obviously it is something, that we should be concerned about. then again, you know, they're war plans, and they, you know, will be implemented depending on the situation at the time. So, you know, the war plan may have a series of options, and then it's always up to the political leadership during a conflict as to which option they choose. So, you know, it's kind of like if you get, you know, the playbook of the opposing football team. Well, you know, the 50 plays they may run, but you don't know which play they're actually going to run on that day. So,
if I could just on the cyber side, I mean, there's been a lot of focus on the war plans and the economic use of cyber warfare, but I just, you know, just to be to put a caution out there that it certainly looks like North Korea is preparing the use of cyber in a pre-conflict or conflict scenario. And so when you look at you overlay what North Korea is doing in the cyberspace, certainly things pop out like trying to make money. That's an easy one for them. They have a long history of illicit activities, trying to steal war plans, maybe a target of opportunity. But I think we shouldn't lose the forest for the trees, so to speak, right? That North Korea is using this capability, understands that time is somewhat on their side, that they can get themselves prepared for an eventual conflict that they might initiate and be able to use that cyber capability not only against South Korea, but against the United States. I mean, people forget that, yes, the Sony hack was terrible, and they did terrible things to Sony, but they threatened a 9/11 attack on theaters that played the movie. So they have shown, and now there's new reports that they have attacked a UK film production company as well. So they're definitely using it in a political way.
okay, I'm going to bring it to a close because our American panelists have other commitments that they have to get to. So if you could join me in welcoming all of our panelists for what I thought was a very, very good conversation. Thank you.